There is a very familiar explanation people often use to comfort themselves after being hurt by a narcissist. They do those things because they have no emotions. We assume they betray, manipulate, abandon, or act cruelly in a calculated way, and then walk away lightly, carrying no emotional aftershocks at all. That belief sounds reasonable. It gives our pain a simple cause. But it is precisely that simplicity that obscures what matters most in what is actually happening beneath the surface. Viewed through the lens of Carl Jung, the issue is not that narcissists feel nothing, but that they cannot remain with their own emotions. Jung did not see human beings as purely moral entities, but as psychological structures constantly operating between consciousness and the shadow. And for the narcissist, that shadow contains what they are not allowed to touch: shame, feelings of inadequacy, vulnerability, and above all, the capacity to acknowledge that they have caused harm. When they hurt you, what occurs is not emotional emptiness, but a moment of ego threat. A moment in which, if they were to stop and fully feel what is happening, the entire image they have constructed of themselves strong, right, superior, could collapse. And because they cannot allow that collapse, they are forced to erect another shell: coldness, silence, indifference, or even arrogance. Not to demonstrate strength, but to avoid facing the truth. This is the crucial point many people miss. The narcissist's silence after hurting you is not peace. It is a form of psychological anesthesia. It is how they sever themselves from emotions that could expose the shadow they have spent a lifetime burying. They do not apologize, not because they do not know they are wrong, but because admitting fault would force them to truly see themselves, and that is what they fear most. So the real question is not, do they feel anything after hurting me? The more accurate question is, what are they trying to conceal in order not to collapse? This video is not meant to justify narcissists, nor to provoke outrage. It exists to clarify something deeper. When you understand what they are compelled to hide, you stop seeking acknowledgement from them, and in that very moment, their power over you begins to end. After causing harm, the first thing that does not happen for a narcissist is relief. Contrary to outward appearances, they do not exit the relationship in a calm or unaffected state. What they enter instead is a quiet form of inner tension, a condition that, if named accurately in the language of Carl Jung, is the moment when the shadow is activated. Immediately following the harmful act, emotions they have long repressed: shame, feelings of inferiority, the fear of being seen through, begin to rise. Not loudly, not visibly, but powerfully enough to threaten the ego structure they are clinging to. The problem is this: the narcissist does not have the capacity to remain with those emotions. To face them would mean having to admit something extremely dangerous to them, that they might be the one who caused harm, that the image of being right, above, superior, that they have constructed contains cracks. And because they cannot tolerate that possibility, they resort to a familiar yet highly refined response: emotional freezing. Jung did not call this a lack of feeling, but a form of psychic numbing, a psychological anesthesia used to protect against inner collapse. It is from this state that silence emerges, not the silence of peace, but the silence of avoidance. Not because they have moved on, but because they are not permitted to feel. The detached attitude, the arrogant tone, the indifferent expression after hurting you are not signs of inner strength, but anesthetic mechanisms. They allow the narcissist, temporarily, not to face guilt, not to touch the shame rising from the shadow. The colder they appear, the more desperately they are trying to keep their defensive system intact. But it is precisely here that a Jungian truth that cannot be ignored begins to reveal itself. According to Jung, what is buried never disappears. It only changes its form of existence. And when emotions are not acknowledged, not made conscious, they do not dissolve, they are displaced. They find another place to manifest, And from this point on, the story no longer ends with silence. According to Carl Jung, no psychological content can be buried forever. What is not made conscious does not vanish. It merely leaves the center of awareness and seeks another place to exist. And for the narcissist, that place is often not within themselves, but on you. The core issue is this: the narcissist cannot tolerate the idea that they themselves are the source of suffering. Not because they are unaware, but because admitting it would place their entire ego structure in a state of danger. To say "I caused harm" is not merely a moral acknowledgement. For the narcissist, it is an existential threat. It triggers a chain of consequences they lack the psychological capacity to handle. The feeling of being wrong, of being deficient, of being incomplete, and worst of all, of not being superior as they believed. And it is at this moment that the shadow is no longer suppressed, it is expelled outward. This is what Jung called projection. Instead of staying with shame and responsibility, the narcissist unconsciously throws that shadow onto another person. The narrative is reversed. It is no longer "I hurt you, but you are too sensitive." No longer "I was wrong, but you are overreacting." No longer "I was cruel, but you deserved it." What must be clearly understood is this: this is not deliberate lying in the ordinary sense. The narcissist does not sit down, calculate, and decide to deceive you like a villain in a simple moral story. Most of what they say at this stage is unconscious self-defense. They believe the story they tell because if they did not, they would have to face a far more terrifying truth, that the darkness lies within themselves. Jung once said something cold but precise: everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. For the narcissist, weakness, cruelty, selfishness, or irresponsibility cannot be integrated into the self because their persona is built upon an image of perfection, correctness, and control. Therefore, those qualities must appear in you. You become the container for their shadow. You carry the sense of being wrong, of being guilty, of being the problem, so that they can continue to believe they are fine. This is why so many empathic people fall into deep confusion after being hurt. You begin to wonder, am I really too sensitive? Did I do something to make things worse? Do I deserve to be treated this way? This disorientation does not arise because you are weak, but because you are standing within the field of a very powerful projection mechanism. When someone else's shadow is poured onto you long enough, it begins to sound like your own truth. But here is the crucial point. Projection does not resolve the narcissist's problem. It only delays collapse. Because a shadow that is not integrated does not disappear. It merely changes its form of expression. And when projection no longer works, when you stop accepting the role of the one at fault, when you begin to stand firmly in your own experience, a deeper, more dangerous emotion begins to surface within the narcissist. An emotion they fear even more than guilt. And that emotion is primitive shame. There is a subtle but decisive distinction in depth psychology, and if it is not named correctly, we will never understand what the narcissist is truly hiding. It is the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. It still allows the ego to retain the capacity to repair, learn, and take responsibility. Shame is different. Shame does not speak about behavior, it speaks about being. It whispers, I am wrong. Something fundamentally defective exists within me. And here we touch the deepest layer of the narcissistic structure. The narcissist does not truly fear making mistakes. They can justify, rationalize, and even take pride in harmful actions if doing so preserves a sense of control. What they fear is not being wrong, but being exposed. Because beneath the carefully polished persona confidence, righteousness, superiority, lies a primitive fear that if fully seen, they will be rejected. In Jungian terms, this is shame bound to an unintegrated shadow, a wounded sense of self formed very early, never healed, only concealed. And then you appear in that story, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. When you are hurt, when you suffer, yet retain your humanity, still able to love, to feel, to hurt truthfully, that very fact creates an unbearable contrast for the narcissist. Because in that moment, you do not merely reflect their behavior, you reflect their lack. You show that a person can cause harm and still take responsibility, can be wounded without denying themselves, and that to them is intolerable. This is why the narcissist cannot look directly at your pain, not because they do not understand, but because understanding would force them to look at themselves. And in that mirror, they would not see merely a wrong action, they would see the possibility that the self they are living from is false. They would see emptiness, fragility, a crack in the identity they have spent a lifetime concealing. Primitive shame does not arrive as a clear emotion. It arrives as an existential threat, a sense that if they pause for too long, everything will collapse. So they turn away, not away from you, but away from themselves. And when they cannot endure standing before that mirror, they have no choice but to shatter it, not merely through silence, but by rewriting the entire story. Because to survive, they need a new reality, one in which they are not the source of pain, one in which shame cannot reach them, and one in which the ego remains intact. And precisely because they cannot endure shame, they are forced to restructure the story. After primitive shame has been touched not as a passing feeling, but as a direct threat to the ego's very existence, the narcissist enters a phase in which the truth becomes impossible to live with. At this point, the issue is no longer right or wrong, no longer who did what to whom. The issue is this: if they continue living inside the story, I harmed another human being, then the entire psychological structure they rely on to survive will collapse. For an ordinary person, accepting that they caused pain can lead to remorse, apology, even change. But for the narcissist, it is not a healing process, it is a death sentence for the persona. In Carl Jung's view, the persona is not merely a social mask. For the narcissist, the persona is the only house they live in. It contains their entire sense of self-worth, control, and superiority, the very things they believe are necessary to keep from being crushed by the shame inside. And therefore, when the old story begins to threaten that house, they have no choice but to build a new story. This is the moment many people misunderstand. The wounded person often thinks the narcissist makes things up to take revenge, to tear them down, to destroy their image. But if you look deep enough, you will see this. The core motive is not revenge, but survival. The narcissist cannot survive in the role of the one who caused harm. That role carries responsibility. It carries shame. It carries the possibility of being seen as an imperfect human being. And so reality must be rewritten, not to defeat you, but to save themselves from inner disintegration. In that new reality, the roles are reversed with near perfection. You are no longer the one who was harmed. You become the toxic one. It is no longer that you were betrayed. You become the betrayer. It is no longer that you were destroyed. You are assigned the role of the one who destroyed them. What is striking is that this story is often not told in the openly angry voice people expect, but in a voice of suffering, grievance, even nobility. The narcissist does not merely turn themselves into a victim, they turn themselves into a pitiful victim. This is the most subtle point of a Jungian smear. It is not simply bad-mouthing. It is a restructuring of the entire meaning of the relationship. Every moment you set a boundary becomes evidence of your coldness. Every time you react to harm becomes evidence that you are emotionally unstable. Every time you go silent to protect yourself becomes a sign that you are manipulating with silence. Reality is distorted, not through a single lie, but through hundreds of small interpretations, each serving one purpose: to push you out of the role of your real humanity and place you into the role of a shadow that carries the shadow for them. What makes this process especially dangerous is that the narcissist believes the story they tell at least enough to keep from collapsing. This is not a script written in full conscious clarity. It is the product of a deep defensive mechanism where consciousness and the unconscious cooperate to create a reality that can be endured. And therefore, when they tell others that you are the destroyer, they do not feel they are lying. They feel they are defending themselves against a threat. For Jung, this is the moment the persona takes full control. The shadow, including cruelty, selfishness, irresponsibility, cannot be integrated, so it must be placed onto someone else. And you, the person who was closest, the one who reflected them most clearly, become the ideal target, not because you are weak, but because you once mattered enough to hold the mirror function. When that bond breaks, the energy of the shadow does not disappear, it becomes a storytelling campaign. And here is an uncomfortable truth that must be said. The narcissist needs an audience for this new story. The persona cannot survive in a vacuum. It needs eyes, agreement, silent nods, consolations. You've been through so much. It's a good thing you got out. That person really has issues. Those responses do not merely protect the image, they protect them from facing shame. Each person who believes their story becomes another layer of cement reinforcing the persona. And here, a paradox appears. The wounded person often tries to explain the truth, to correct the record, to prove they are not the toxic one described. But that very act can sometimes unintentionally fuel the narrative the narcissist is building. Because to the persona, any reaction can be interpreted as evidence. If you argue back, you are defensive. If you stay silent, you are cruel. If you are hurt, you are playing the victim. One eye cast. This is why Jung emphasized that truth has no power inside a space where the persona is ruling. In that space, what matters is not what happened, but which story allows the ego to survive. And the narcissist will cling to the story that spares them from seeing who they are inside. But no persona can survive forever without energy. And this is the shift very few people recognize. Every narrative requires participation. It needs listeners. It needs reactions. It needs the labeled target to remain inside that role. When you argue, explain, refute, you are still standing on their stage. But when you withdraw from the role not through rage, but through non-participation, the story begins to falter. Because a story, no matter how sophisticated, cannot echo forever if no one is dialoguing with it. And right here, another Jungian truth begins to operate. When projection has no foothold, it returns to its source. The persona begins to lose energy. The narrative begins to become repetitive, rigid, less convincing. And what the narcissist fears most, the inner emptiness, begins to re-emerge. Beneath the seemingly quiet surface of no contact or absolute neutrality, a very deep psychological event is unfolding inside the narcissist, an event whose nature is easily misunderstood if we do not look through Carl Jung's lens. Many people think silence means leaving, retreating, losing power. But for the narcissistic structure, silence is not a harmless void. It is the withdrawal of the very thing that sustains their entire ecosystem, reflection. The narcissist does not exist the way ordinary people exist. They do not have a stable self nourished from within. Instead, they exist through external feedback eyes, emotions, reactions, attention, the pain or confusion of others. Every reaction from you was once a piece of mirror that helped them recognize who they were, powerful or powerless, right or wrong, central or abandoned. As long as you reacted, whether by crying, explaining, raging, or defending yourself, their persona still had energy to function. They still felt they existed. But the moment you become silent in the true Jungian sense, not silent as punishment, not silent as waiting, but silent as withdrawal from the mirroring role, something very different happens. You stop providing emotional data. You stop validating the narrative. You stop standing inside their psychological space. And when there is no reaction, the persona begins to lose its life source. Not immediately through a dramatic collapse, but through a deeply uncomfortable sense of misalignment. Familiar tactics suddenly stop working. What makes this state lethal is not that you disappear, but that no one is carrying the shadow for them anymore. Before, when the shadow rose, shame, rage, inferiority, guilt, it could be pushed onto you through projection. You reacted, you hurt, you doubted yourself, and thus the shadow was discharged outward. But when you are silent, there is nowhere to throw the shadow, no mirror to distort, no one to take the role of the one at fault. The shadow is forced to return to its source. In Jung's terms, this is the moment of ego rupture, not awakening, not full collapse yet, but a highly unstable condition. The persona still tries to hold its old shape, while the energy required to maintain it is draining away. The narcissist begins to feel empty, restless, irritated, without knowing why. They may tell others they are fine, that they have moved on, but inside is a profound disorientation, because for the first time they are not being reflected. That is why your silence often does not produce peace in them, but produces confusing reactions, delayed hoovering, escalating smear, or an exaggerated indifference that is performative. None of these are signs of power. They are desperate attempts to reactivate reflection, because without reflection, the persona cannot confirm its own existence, and for a self built entirely from the outside, that is an existential threat. The paradox is this: the more correctly you stay silent, the less you do, the greater the psychological impact becomes. Not because you are punishing them, but because you are no longer participating in the mechanism that kept them standing. You are no longer the place where they dump the shadow, no longer the person who helps them avoid the inner emptiness. And that emptiness, if not filled by reflection, begins to expose what they have been running from their entire life. What makes many people misunderstand hoovering is that they view it through the lens of ordinary emotion. When the narcissist returns texts, probes, bait, accidental appearances, revived memories, the wounded person easily thinks, maybe they miss me, maybe they realized I mattered. But if we look through Carl Jung's lens, we see a harder truth. Hoovering does not come from love, but from the hunger of the shadow. Hoovering is not the return of the heart. It is the resurfacing of a psychological structure that is running out of oxygen. When you have been silent long enough, when reflection has been withdrawn, when the persona is no longer fed by your reactions, the shadow has nowhere to discharge. And a starved shadow will try to return to the very source that once allowed it to be handled without becoming conscious. Hoovering is an attempt to restore the old internal regulation mechanism, not an attempt to reconnect with you as an independent human being. The key point is this: the narcissist does not return because they need you, but because they need the function you once performed. In the previous relationship, you were not only a lover, a friend, an attachment, you were a psychological regulator. You reacted, you explained, you endured, you doubted yourself, and those reactions helped them avoid directly facing the primitive feelings inside: shame, emptiness, imperfection. When you disappear, that system loses a crucial link. Hoovering is an attempt to reattach that link. That is why hoovering often does not appear immediately. It arrives when the shadow begins to starve for real, when other sources of reflection are not strong enough, when the new narrative begins to wear down, when the persona must overwork to maintain the image, when nights grow longer than days, and the void can no longer be filled with external noise. Hoovering tends to come not after a breakup, but after a silence long enough to expose the emptiness. This also explains why hoovering rarely takes the form of, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," because a real apology would require making the shadow conscious exactly what hoovering is designed to avoid at all costs. Instead, it appears in more ambiguous forms: nostalgia, regret, casual check-ins, or even provocation. Not to understand you, but to trigger reaction. As long as you react, even with anger or coldness, the persona has data again, and the shadow has somewhere to be dumped. But when you do not return, something very different happens within the narcissist's psyche. You do not simply become someone who left, you become an unresolved symbol. In Jungian psychology, what is not completed in the unconscious persists as a complex and autonomous cluster of psychic energy. When hoovering fails, you stop being a concrete person. You become a hanging question inside them, an image they cannot control, cannot rewrite, cannot absorb into a new narrative. This is what very few people understand correctly. Obsession is not love, but the loss of the ability to end the story in the way they need. For the narcissist, every relationship must end in a way that preserves their power. Either they leave, or they win, or they are seen as the noble victim. When you withdraw into silence and do not return, you refuse to grant them any of those endings. And that absence of an ending turns you into a psychological object they cannot digest. From a Jungian perspective, this is when you become an autonomous symbol in their psyche. You no longer sit under the control of the persona, yet you do not disappear. You exist as a silent reminder of their limits, not because you are perfect, but because you no longer participate. And for a personality structure that lives off the participation of others, nothing is more unsettling than someone who withdraws without collapsing. The paradox is this: the more you do not return, the more you exist in their inner world, in an unwanted way, not as an object to possess, but as evidence that there are human beings who cannot be manipulated forever. Failed hoovering does not lead to awakening. It leads to defensive restructuring. But every restructuring forces the persona to strain harder and the shadow to grow hungrier. And here a clear boundary must be set. Hoovering is not a second chance, and it is not a sign that you are special in a romantic sense. It is a sign that you once held a very important position, the position of regulating their internal avoidance. When you refuse to return to that position, you do not merely leave the relationship. You leave the psychological role they need in order not to face themselves. That is why the right question at this stage is no longer, what are they hiding? Because their shadow has already been revealed through the very behavior of hoovering. The deeper and more important question is, what are you seeing? You are seeing that the return is not love, but hunger. You are seeing that your silence is not loss, but boundary. And you are seeing that when you do not return, you are not hurting them, you are simply no longer helping them run. The decisive moment does not arrive when the narcissist returns, nor when they go silent or collapse. The decisive moment arrives when you stop waiting for something from them, when you stop searching for an apology that may never exist, when you no longer need them to acknowledge your pain, for that pain to be valid. It is here that a profound shift occurs, not in them, but in you. Throughout the relationship, the shadows seem to belong to the narcissist. Cruelty, coldness, manipulation, denial. You were the clean one, the one who endured, who tried to understand, who kept their humanity. But that is only the surface. In Carl Jung's view, the shadow is not simply evil located in the other person. The shadow is the disowned part of the entire relational system. And in a narcissist-empath dynamic, many shadow elements have been displaced onto you in more subtle ways. Suppressed rage, self-doubt, The sense that you must carry responsibility for someone else's emotions, and especially the belief that if you love enough, everything can be saved. When you stop seeking an apology, the first thing you do is not forgive them. You withdraw energy from a dangerous assumption, the assumption that your truth requires their confirmation. When you do not need their acknowledgement, you end the role of the one waiting to be seen. And at that moment, the shadow begins to change hands. No longer suspended between two people, no longer thrown back and forth through projection, the shadow returns to the only place where it can be processed in a healthy way, your consciousness. This is not a pleasant moment. Integrating the shadow does not feel like victory. It feels like a cold sobriety. You begin to see what you once did not dare to see, that you stayed too long, that you were silent when you needed to speak, that you sacrificed boundaries to keep peace, that parts of you were more accustomed to being needed than to being respected. But unlike the narcissist, you have the capacity to remain with that truth. You do not have to smash the mirror. You can look into it and not disappear. Jung called this process individuation, the becoming of a whole human being who no longer lives by another person's reflection. When individuation begins, you no longer hold the role of mirror. You are no longer the place where others find themselves or flee from themselves. You become an independent center of consciousness where light and shadow can coexist without denial. This does not make you better in a moral sense. It makes you more real. And this is the point many people misunderstand. When the shadow is integrated, you do not become cold or closed off. On the contrary, you become clear. Clear about what is yours and what is not. Clear about which emotions must be felt and which emotions you do not have to carry. Clear that love does not mean endurance, and empathy does not mean self-erasure. This clarity can look like distance to people who are used to living in ambiguity. But for you, it is inner stability for the first time, one that does not require reflection. When the shadow changes hands, a subtle paradox appears. You no longer obsess over whether they learned their lesson, not because you are numb, but because that story is no longer your story. You do not need them to collapse in order to stand. You do not need them to admit fault in order to move forward. And it is precisely this lack of need that you did not have before. It is not pride, it is sovereignty. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment energy withdraws from the old bond and returns to the center. Libido is no longer trapped in fixing someone else, explaining the past, or hoping for a different ending. It returns to nourish your present life, and when that happens, you begin to see clearly. This entire journey was never only about the narcissist. They were merely the catalyst that forced you to meet yourself at the deepest level. After everything that has been stripped back, perhaps the most important thing to say is this. The journey you have just been through was never only a story about the narcissist. They are not the center. They are not the destination. They are the catalyst, an impact force powerful enough to compel a person to face the deepest parts of themselves, the parts that, in an ordinary life, might never be touched. For Carl Jung, genuine human awakening does not come from comfortable relationships, but from relationships that expose the shadow not to destroy us, but to give us the chance to integrate what has been abandoned for a long time. And in a relationship with a narcissist, what was revealed was not only their darkness, but also the areas in you that had not yet been made conscious. The need to be chosen, the fear of abandonment, the habit of carrying responsibility for other people's emotions, and the belief that love is the same as endurance. When you are still trapped in seeking an answer from them, an apology, an acknowledgement, a sign of remorse, you are still living inside their psychological reality, a reality where power belongs to the one who never has to explain. But the moment you stop waiting for that, a different order begins to form. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. You no longer need your truth to be confirmed from the outside, because you have matured enough to remain with the truth of your own experience. This does not make you a winner in the ordinary sense. There is no glory, no applause, only a quiet shift. You no longer react the way you used to, not because you have become numb, but because you are no longer being activated from the old places. The tactics that once confused you become easy to recognize. The narratives that once made you doubt yourself now sound hollow. Not because you're above them, but because you have stepped off the stage where those games have meaning. And here is the paradox very few people notice. When you stop trying to prove that you are right, you also stop being trapped in the need for them to be wrong. Freedom does not come from reversing the narcissist's story. It comes from no longer living inside any story that requires them to be the main character. You do not need them to collapse in order to stand. You do not need them to acknowledge you for your pain to have value. That value existed the moment you experienced it, whether anyone witnessed it or not. At the deepest level, this entire process is a lesson in inner sovereignty. You learn that empathy does not mean losing yourself, that love does not require you to carry someone else's shadow, and that real maturity is not rescuing someone from their darkness, but refusing to let another person's darkness define your life. When you integrate your own shadow, your anger, your wounds, your limits, your clarity, you do not become harder, you become more honest. From this vantage point, you can see it clearly. The narcissist was never a test you had to pass, nor karma you were meant to endure. They were the point where the path had to turn, an intersection where you either continue to live by reflection or began to live by consciousness. And the fact that you are here now able to look back, name what happened, and no longer be pulled into it is already the clearest answer to that journey. So, if there is one thing to carry forward after all these analyses, it is not knowledge about the narcissist. It is awareness of yourself. You do not need to understand more about them in order to be free. You only need to understand this: what they hide, what they cannot bear to see, what they run from no longer belongs to you. You have withdrawn from the mirroring role. You have integrated your own darkness. And from there, you no longer walk as a victim of the past, but as a person living in the reality of your own life, awake, whole, and needing no one's confirmation.